Well, good morning again, and thank you for being here for what I think is a truly urgent conversation about discrimination in housing. I'd like to begin with one distressing fact about the big picture, and that's the homeownership gap between Black and white Americans, and that it is wider today than under the Jim Crow era when segregation was legal. So, Andre, you've done some work in this area. I'm hoping you can help us understand why.
Well, the black homeowner, white homeownership gap is lower than it was during the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968. So it's at around 43%, 41% given, 40% giving whatever metric you want to use. And certainly people will point to the recession. But as we know, we're in a state of full employment, the economy is booming, and the Black homeownership rate has not rebounded in the same way as other groups have, particularly among whites. And so we really got to stay focused on the discrimination that's occurring not only in the housing market, so you certainly have discrimination in lending practices, in appraisals, in real estate agent behavior, but you also have to look at discrimination in the cities at large. Black people are concentrated in cities, and in those places, and I mentioned about full employment, which is certainly, we're seeing record lows in terms of unemployment. But when you look under the hood and you see Black employment rates, they're double that of rates. So Blacks have less buying power. But I just want to stay focused. The reason why the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968 is because of the discrimination. These gaps really show some relaxation on enforcement of discrimination throughout the housing process. And I know Lisa wants to chime in because Lisa is probably the expert in this area.
Lisa, please.
Well, I really appreciate, Andre, all of the research that you do because it's so informative. And one of the other things for us to think about is the fact that for over 300 years of American history, all of our policies, well, the majority of our policies, our housing policies, our lending policies, were race-based. They were designed with racial animus against people of color, and they were specifically designed to support our white brothers and sisters. And so what we did, as Andre pointed out, when we passed the Federal Fair Housing Act, what we said was, on a going forward basis, we're not going to tolerate discrimination anymore, but we're not going to do anything to fix the structural inequities, the systemic barriers that are the apparatus, that are the foundation of our housing market and our housing system. And so as a result, we didn't do anything to eliminate residential segregation, as Andre pointed out. We left residential segregation intact. We left all of the other systemic bias and the discriminatory systemic apparatuses that we are challenged with today. We left all of that intact. And so that is why today seemingly neutral policies applied throughout the marketplace will manifest discriminatory outcomes.
This brings us to something called the Disparate Impact Standard. It sounds like you were describing that. HUD under this administration is seeking to gut a number of Obama-era rules and protections, and one important one is the Disparate Impact Standard. Can you explain what it is and why that's important?
Yeah, certainly. So disparate impact is basically unintentional discrimination. So it is the application of a policy or a practice, and you apply that policy or practice uniformly in a consistent fashion, to all consumers, but the application of that policy has a discriminatory effect in the marketplace. So one example, I can give you an example of a case that we brought involving insurance redlining. Insurance companies adopted a policy whereby they said if your house was built before a certain date, in some of the cases it was 1950, in some of the cases it was 1945. So if your house is built before that date, we will not give you insurance, or you cannot get quality insurance. You could get a residual inferior policy, but you cannot get quality insurance. And we found in cities like Chicago and Detroit and Toledo, many cities across the nation, again, because of residential segregation and racial steering, African Americans and Latinos disproportionately live in older housing stock. So it's important to note that these policies weren't tied to the condition of the house, it was tied to the age of the house, and that manifested discriminatory outcomes. And so many policies that we see employed today manifest those same discriminatory outcomes because where you live matters. Where you live affects every single thing about you. If you give me your address, I can predict your credit score, I can predict your insurance score, I can predict whether or not you're a homeowner, I can tell you your chances of being incarcerated, I can tell you your health outcome. If you give me your address, I can tell you how long you're gonna live. Because place in America is inextricably linked to opportunity.
And I will say, place is inextricably linked to people. We devalue places because we devalue black people. One of the research projects I did, I explored price differences between a majority black places and those where the share of the black population was less than 1%. And we found after controlling for crime, after controlling for education and all those things that homeowners look at, we found that homes in black neighborhoods are priced 23% lower than homes in white neighborhoods. That amounts to about $48,000 per home, about $156 billion lost in essentially equity on the homes. And we know where that $156 billion goes. It goes to education. It goes to infrastructure. It goes to people whether if they want to move to another community or not. So we're robbing people who are doing everything required of them of the American dream, robbing them of the opportunities because they're black.
Right. Among the things HUD is proposing is to strip transgender protections at homeless shelters. That is, to allow a shelter to reject someone on, say, religious grounds, even as they're accepting federal dollars. So another question is, are fair housing laws effective at all for LGBTQ Americans?
Well, the ERC has been doing what we call testing work. It's investigations using a method we call testing, sending folks in to apply for housing that mimic a certain protected category. So we've been doing a lot of work in the LGBT space, particularly looking in places like Virginia and Florida to see if we are seeing discrimination against LGBT folks as they're searching for housing. And we are seeing it. The unfortunate thing is there are some jurisdictions, a lot of jurisdictions in the United States that don't interpret the Fair Housing Act to cover LGBT applicants. So we have mainly focused on how we educate people that discrimination is happening, and also working with housing providers, because housing providers are business people. They understand that there is a market out there, and they want to be able to rent to as many, most of them do at least, want to be able to rent to as many people as possible. So there's value in actually taking that data and giving it to housing providers and telling them that this is happening on your front line. You need to train your people on your front line to not engage in discriminatory behavior.
And I'll just add on to that, if I can, to talk a little bit about the rule and the weight of it. This rule would allow shelters to deny transgender people who are experiencing homelessness from accessing those shelters. And we know that this is a life and death issue, literally, because transgender people who are unsheltered are at much higher risk for violence on the streets. And so this is a completely unacceptable and cruel rule, and we, with our partners, will be fighting back on it.
Fighting back, right.
Absolutely.
Just a reminder to the audience that we'll be coming for your questions in a moment. But first, Melvina, the Equal Rights Center has done a lot of work on discrimination against disabled people. So I want to ask you about the building codes. Are they really successful in helping the disabled navigate housing?
No. So the ERC started an initiative about 15 years ago because the disability community was telling us that housing was really the biggest barrier for them. And we started doing investigations of large multifamily housing providers, apartments, condominiums around the country. And 15 years ago, it was hard to find a building anywhere across the United States that didn't have significant accessibility barriers for people with disabilities. So again, we started confronting housing providers with that data. Some of them wanted to be educated. Some of them we ultimately had to sue. We just recently resolved within the last 2 years the largest case out of all of those investigations. And as a result, that builder is making 85 buildings across the country more accessible for people with disabilities. The other thing we've done is engage those housing providers, though, and try to meet them where they are. So we've tried to go to the places where they are actually getting educated. We've tried to build tech tools. One thing we are hearing consistently from them is we don't understand why when the folks come in to check for building code violations, they're not also checking to see if there are issues with accessibility. So we've tried to start to meet people at the building code level, trying to figure out where are they getting educated. We've spoke to large groups of architects because we understand that if you build it the right way the first time, it's going to be a lot cheaper first, right? So we're trying to help meet them there. We have always done kind of written publications for housing providers to figure out how to build their buildings in compliance with the Fair Housing Act. And one thing we heard was that people were taking the books out to building sites. And so we said, well, what do you have in terms of apps? And they're like, well, we've got iTunes and iPhones and stuff like that. So we took that information and we essentially put it in a real-time app so that they could check while they were on site to see if they were actually in compliance with the accessibility requirements of the Fair Housing Act. So it's really, I kind of put businesses and housing providers in 3 different buckets, right? You have those that are doing the right thing, and you want to work with those people and uplift what they're doing. And then you have those that would do better if they knew better, and those are the people that you want to train. And the ERC has developed a number of online courses to meet them because a lot of them do their training online. And then there are the people who really just don't care. And those are the people that you have to sue. Particularly if they are large housing providers, focusing your efforts on those folks is really important because it sends a message downstream to all housing providers that you have to build housing that's accessible.
You recently had a suit against one of the largest apartment builders in the country. What happened with that suit?
That was the one that we actually resolved, and all of those buildings across the country are now going to be accessible. I mean, one thing I do want to say about just the aging of the population, I know you guys are going to be talking about that a little bit later. I sat in a mediation with one of these builders, and they looked me straight in the mouth and said, well, people with disabilities can't afford our apartments. And my response was, I have bad knees now, so you're about to have like a tsunami of people who need accessible housing. And they're saying like by the year 2050, like 1 in 3 people are going to live in a home with a person with a disability. So, builders who ignore this market are going to do so at their financial peril.
Right, our population is aging.
Yes.
And the number of people who will be developing disabilities as time goes on will only be on the rise.
It's a tsunami.
Yeah.
And housing is a civil rights issue. Everyone needs affordable housing. I know housing has been the main wealth building device and throughout our history. But now we're at a place where it's clear that people deserve to have a home, to anchor themselves in communities. We see all across the country people being pushed out, renters being pushed out because there's not enough affordable housing, prices are skyrocketing. We're critiquing many of the presidential candidates' proposals. For instance, several of them use formerly redlining districts as sort of a vector for their policies to create more home ownership for Black and brown Americans. And particularly Black Americans, but what they didn't check is Black people don't live in formerly redlined districts anymore. It's actually, we did recently released a study last week, me and my colleague David Harshbarger, that showed that it goes Latinos, then whites, then Blacks who live in formerly redlined districts. and blacks only that folks who live in red line districts only are 8%. Blacks are only 8% in that population.
Really?
So we got to figure out new ways to address age-old discrimination.
Right. Well, speaking of affordable housing, Sarah, what's the number one thing a city can do to encourage more affordable housing being built?
Well, every level of government has a role to play in addressing the shortage of housing, and local governments are in the best position to address moderately priced housing by reducing land use and zoning barriers that drive up costs by restricting the supply of housing. But it's really important to know that even in places, even if local governments were to really relax their local land use and zoning regulations to increase supply, there still would be a significant shortage, a severe shortage of housing for the very poorest households. And that's because there's this tipping point between what the private sector can build and what they just can't. It doesn't make a lot of sense for developers to build housing that's that deeply affordable because the rents they take in wouldn't be enough to keep the property going or to build it in the first place. And so that points to a really important need for robust federal resources to build deeply, deeply affordable homes to the very lowest income people. And we see that trend where the shortage is greatest at the lowest end. We see that in rural, urban, suburban areas. We see it in every congressional district. It's truly a national problem that's really not being addressed at the scale that's needed.
Do you have any faith that it will be addressed?
Well, I'm really pleased to see so many presidential candidates are putting out really bold, innovative, large-scale housing plans. We can critique them. There's lots to critique and give feedback on. But this is really the first time I've seen presidential candidates talking about housing and putting it out there on the campaign trail.
It is a really positive step.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to turn to the audience. We have a mic runner. Are there any questions right now? Yes.
My name is Barbara Moreland, and I work with the affordable housing in Arlington, Virginia. The question is, one, getting to the point of being able to purchase a place, whatever they may be renting, because rent proves you can make a house payment, but it doesn't necessarily help you to have that down payment. Are there ways in which all that previously paid rent could be applied as a down payment?
Well, that's a great question. One of the challenges that we face is the increasing unaffordability of housing for middle-income Americans. So teachers, firefighters, police officers cannot afford to rent a housing unit, an apartment, in the areas where they live. And that unaffordability is growing. What that means is that it's reducing people's ability to save for a house. Now, there are some programs, and some programs have come under a great deal of scrutiny for the way they have taken advantage of people. So think land contract deals, land contract programs, which were at one time in America primarily the only way that African Americans and other people of color could access housing, because redlining and lending discrimination was so robust. But those land contract programs were abusive and they were predatory, and they took advantage of people, and people really could not sustain the homes that they were seeking to purchase. But there are some lease-to-own programs that are run by a nonprofit, community-based and community development organizations that are designed to support consumers. And so you can, if you're dealing with the right organization, you can operate a program and take advantage of those lease-to-own situations where a portion of your rent is being saved in an escrow account to build up a down payment for you to be able to purchase the asset.
I'd love to add on to that too, just to show the connection between the shortage of affordable housing for deeply poor families and the rest of the housing market. So I mentioned before, I should have mentioned before, that the shortage for the very lowest income people, that's the only population in which there's an absolute shortage of housing. And as that grows, there's two main effects. One, the very poorest households are paying 50, 60, 70% of their income on rent. It means they have less money for putting groceries on the table or paying for their medical bills. But it also has an impact on more middle-class renters who want to save for a down payment. So you see all of those very poor households living in housing that would otherwise be available to middle-income renters, and that pushes up housing costs too. So until we address that shortage at the low end, we'll never see that correction in the market because we're not addressing the market failure.
You don't get there unless the largest landlords in our country, meaning the municipalities, take bold steps in zoning for increased density and affordability. Mayors and city council folks can do this. But it will come from the demands of the people in those cities to make that happen. But another just key point, we do need a different type of way to measure credit. There is what's mentioned in the initial panel, that many of our credit scoring systems are just antiquated. We have plenty of people who pay bills on time, but because they receive low incomes, they can't afford many of the homes in their locales. And so, yes, we need mayors to do their part. We need new credit scoring systems. And we need to eliminate discrimination, and this gets to your other point, in the job market. Because if people can't afford a home, all these programs won't necessarily take hold.
See, in talking about housing for low-income folks, I think it's important to also highlight the Housing Choice Voucher program. The ERC has been doing a lot of work on preventing source of income discrimination. I mean, we have this voucher program out there, and what we're finding is there are a lot of people who can't even use their voucher.
That's right.
And in particular, one of the goals of that program is to get people to use their vouchers in high-opportunity neighborhoods and places where they can get a good education and they have good access to good grocery stores and have better health outcomes and things like that. One of the things that we've been seeing is just rampant discrimination against voucher holders in their attempt to actually find available housing in the district, but really even around the country. One of the things we would like to see, obviously we're focusing on kind of larger developers in wards 1 and 3, places where there are higher opportunities, but there are a lot of kind of small micro landlords out there that have good places for people to live. In most places, you have to get a license to actually rent out units. That's a perfect opportunity to educate these landlords about their obligations to comply with source of income laws, and not even just source of income laws, but frankly, all housing laws. If you're going to rent a unit, you're a business owner, you need to be educated about how you're supposed to be renting that unit and making that space available for low-income families.
I will say also that this issue of housing affordability is starting to impact more members of Congress, maybe people we hadn't seen as being housing advocates before. So we're seeing bipartisan proposals to use federal dollars to pressure local governments to address their land use and zoning regulations. And we're seeing legislation that looks at how do we expand, how do we look at credit, and how do we make sure renters are being able to play a role there. So I think this is starting to be an issue where we can see more broad bipartisan support for, and we're really hopeful about that.
Well, we touched on it a bit earlier, but let's go back to the 2020 candidates. Who's got the best housing plan?
Nobody.
Well, I will say this, and I mentioned this earlier. I appreciate, as you mentioned, the effort to address historical discrimination, but they can't rigidly use the same tools. Audre Lorde said you can't use the master's tool to break down the master's house. And that's true. You can't use FHA, the Federal Highway Administration highways. You can't use formerly red line districts. Because time has passed and because of migration, because of gentrification, because of a number of issues, people are now spread out and discrimination impacts different communities differently. And so we need a whole set of tools. The problem with the presidential candidates, they have these universal sort of categorical policies that don't necessarily fit. You actually need a menu of different policies to address the various circumstances in which discrimination manifests itself in the various cities. And that's what I'm not seeing. No, I represent Brookings. I'm nonpartisan. I just want to put that out there. I do like, although she uses formerly red line districts, I like the depth of Warren's policy. I like the depth of Buttigieg's Douglas plan because it addresses multiple things. This is not just about housing discrimination, and it is about discrimination at large, but there are things we can do in the housing market that we've relaxed upon, and we have to reassert moving forward.
And if I could just add, many people know Pamela Patton-Node, who is the former Deputy Secretary of HUD under President Trump. In the 2016 election, Pamela crisscrossed the country and met with every Republican candidate to talk to them about just these issues that we are talking about, to get them to adopt a housing platform, a housing agenda, and not one did. So the one thing I will say is in this presidential cycle, housing is very much on the table. Yeah. All of the candidates are talking about it, and that is going to force the conversation in the national debate come this election cycle.
I think we have to leave it right there. Thank you very much. I appreciate your expertise on this issue.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.